Welcome back, listeners, to the Academy DEI podcast. Today, we are thrilled to have Audrey Tousant Shelby, MSW. Audrey is a clinical assistant professor of practicum education at USC and a dedicated child welfare professional with 16 years of experience in public and private sectors. With expertise in workforce development, cultural responsiveness, and equity, she has led initiatives to transform foster care into a system focused on child well being. An adoptee herself, Audrey is passionate about addressing disparities in care for children of color and uplifting practices that promote family stability and reunification. Shane, let me turn it over to you to get our conversation started.
Wonderful. Thank you, Charlie. And thanks for being with us, Audrey.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
All right, to start us off, would you begin by telling us a bit about yourself, your background, what sparked your interest in learning about and then training on intersectionality?
Hey, so I'm a social worker. I've been a social worker now for 19 years. But my focus has been in child welfare. So just like how Charlie shared in my background, I've been in child welfare about 16 years, really focusing on this full spectrum. So from prevention through to adoption services. But my passion really has been around trying to understand just the contributing factors to disproportionality. And so why children of color keep coming into the child welfare system and staying longer, particularly that for Black and Native American children. So that really has been my interest. I enjoy training and teaching social workers, so that is my passion. I think during my work of focusing on disproportionality, I learned a lot about just issues of discrimination, systemic and institutional racism. And so that really has started my journey there. I've been a trainer with the Academy, probably we're going on 10 years now. And so my early trainings were around fairness and equity and how do we remove barriers in child welfare. And so that really has stuck with me over the rest of my career. So really hoping that even in conversations like today and in the classroom or in the training room, that we can start to educate one another on how we impact people's lives and hopefully remove some of these barriers that we're seeing around discrimination and oppression. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Absolutely. Thank you for that introduction. And I think that'll really take us to our conversation today and really setting the foundation for our audience. Like, how would you define intersectionality so that our audience can get keyed into that?
Yeah, I would define intersectionality as a framework, right? So the idea is that our multiple identities, so it could be our race, our culture, our religion, our sexual orientation, those multiple factors that make up who we are can in times have us to cause discrimination or or oppressed or have different barriers when we come into systems. And so those varying identities intersect. So I'm not just a woman, I'm a Black woman. And so I may experience discrimination because not just being a woman, but also being a Black woman, right? And someone else has other identities. And so it's just understanding how people show up in the world and then how systems impact who they are.
How would you say, so we have this kind of foundational understanding of intersectionality. It's the little bits that make us who we are. How does one's intersectional identity influence systems of privilege and oppression within an organization?
Oh, definitely. I think so. We talk about positionality being our multiple identities, and there's some identities that we have that we may seem you, like I said before, you may experience discrimination or oppression, but there's other parts of our identity that give us access to privilege, right? So think of things like class or possibly gender. And so then when we bring all those people into a workplace, absent of understanding people's different lived experiences and the structures in which we come together in a workplace, it can either be a positive thing or it can be a negative impact, just depending on, I think, how organizations are open to experiencing different people, different lived experiences, different identities, different values. And so it can be very positive as we have and need difference in organizations, difference in thought process, decision making. But if we have an organization or people who are not open to how we contribute to society uniquely, it can definitely create some barriers.
Yeah, and I think part of our conversation today comes into play of How do we then define intersectionality? But you also mentioned another key term in there, which was positionality. So how would you define that? What is that so that our audience can know that too?
Yeah, so we talk about intersectionality as our individual identities, right? Then positionality are the social context and political context in which we've grown up, right? So, for example, you may be a middle class male, right? So, being middle class is a part of your social context. It also is a part of your positionality. I'm adopted, as you shared. That's a part of my positionality. So, when I step into a room with other child welfare leaders, I have a different view on trying to keep families together than maybe someone who had a traditional upbringing, wasn't adopted, grew up with two parents. So my positionality gives me a very unique view on the world. And so that's what the positionality is. It's how we see the world based on our lived experiences. And there's a lot of richness to that. As I work with social workers and students who are coming into social work, I really have them think about who are you and how do you show up in a space. So when you're sitting either in a room across from an individual client or you're walking into a meeting, how you are is what you bring to the fullness of that experience. And it's going to be different from the other person, right? It could be somebody who also is Black, a Black female like me, but maybe they're from Texas or they're from somewhere else, and I'm from Los Angeles. Me growing up in LA gives me a different social context from somebody maybe from the South or from another country. So it shapes what your lived experience looks like and how you see the world. And in that richness and through, I think through sharing our different stories, we get to learn more about one another and have a better view on, I think, just identity in general.
Thank you for helping us get on the same page with some of those definitions. So thinking about them, in what ways, in from your perspective, in what ways can organizations effectively incorporate the concepts of intersectionality and positionality into their diversity and inclusion initiatives, so their DEI initiatives?
That's a really good question. I think I would start with looking at the why, right? Why do you have DEI initiatives? I would say since the pandemic and the death of George Floyd and others, there's been a push for DEI in the workplace and DEI in different spaces. And it's important for us to think about why we're doing things so that this is not a checkbox to say, oh, we have this DEI initiative or this ADEI initiative, but really what is the thought behind it? And so if the thought is really for us to have a workplace where people feel like they belong and they're included, then I think you speak to your employees about what is it that you need. How can we shape this experience here in work that you feel like you're valued, you feel like you are respected, and you can contribute to the space in a way that's authentic and genuine and create safety, psychological safety in the workplace? That's what I would say. I would say start with your people, ask them what they need. There's plenty of resources around these things, but I think you start with the people that you're serving, and that'll be the first place.
Yeah, and it definitely will stem from the folks who are in need and who I think there's another piece of that too, that the sort of psychological safety and just like how they can be in a place where they feel safe to even share about those needs as well.
Right.
And like you mentioned before, that there is this piece of positionality of discrimination coming into play as well, and just how folks are in the spaces they're in and just inherently who they are. It
Mhm.
it puts them in a place of any historical discrimination or any just workplace safety in a sense
Mhm.
as well. And so I think we can now bring in the conversation of like how do various forms of discrimination intersect and what challenges does that pose for marginalized individuals or groups?
I think, yeah, that's a good question. And that's a big answer. Like I think it intersects in multiple ways, depending on everything. It can be gender, it can be race, it can be immigration status, it can be ableism. And I think when people are experiencing discrimination at multiple points, it can be very overwhelming. It can be very defeating to feel like, how am I supposed to push against these large systems that are impacting me? And I think that we're talking about DEI and we're talking about the social context in which we are today. And a lot of these programs in education and in the workplace are being eliminated. And so then we talk about what's the other side of this? If we're not creating a safe space for people to be accepted, if we're not creating a safe space to say, yes, I am all of these identities and I'm being marginalized and I'm being oppressed, then what is the other answer? And I don't know that I have that for you. We have to have systems that will allow people to be themselves, and that will create opportunities to level up those who have been marginalized, who are starting at a lower disadvantaged place, to try to balance out the playing field. But if we don't have, I think, policymakers and communities that are willing to do that, then you continue to have people who are isolated and suffering in silence. I don't know if that fully answers your question, because I don't know that I can answer that question. You see what I'm saying? I'm a Black woman, and I'm well educated, I'm middle class, and I have some really great privileges. And in other instances, if I'm walking down the street in sweatsuit, just taking a walk, somebody just sees a Black woman, and they're going to take whatever ideas that go with that. So I think it's very complex, is what I would say.
And it does seem a bit like it starts with an own understanding of your personal intersectional identities. And I think
Absolutely.
so we recently had a conversation about affective capacity building, and that too, that experience in building our own affective capacity starts with recognizing ourselves and what we're bringing to the table, and what emotions we're carrying with us.
Mhm.
So I guess with that in mind, and think about the self, how can individuals better recognize and address their own biases when it comes to intersectionality? And I would say both for themselves and then working with others.
I think that's really good. I think we have to start with knowing ourselves and being honest with ourselves. And sometimes if you don't have, or if you don't feel like you have safe people around you, it's hard to have that honest conversation. But I would start with have the conversation with yourself. And if you have friends or loved ones that are safe to say, hey, I'm struggling with this. This was my experience. This is what I was taught. This is how I grew up. I don't know if this is actually right. Maybe I'm seeing things that are counter to this, but how can I start working in this area? And then hopefully you have safe people that can say, you know what, that's okay. That is some learned narratives that are not accurate. And there's trainings, there's documentaries, there's books, there's different things that we can read to try to unlearn some of the stereotypes and things that we've picked up. But I think in terms of the bias, acknowledge what it is. And sometimes I think we have like implicit bias. We don't know that we have the different biases, but we've just been going along life so long in such the same way. And then it's not till you encounter something else as, oh, well, wait a minute. Maybe this isn't quite what I thought it is. Harvard has, and it's an old assessment, but they have an implicit bias assessment. And you can do that. It's free. And I've taken that before, and I'm like, I don't know if this is right, but I've been open to taking it. And so I think it's really having those courageous conversations and having safe people to have that conversation with is good. I think in terms of the workplace, because you also asked about that. A few years ago, I took this 5-day intensive DEI training through Visions Inc. And it really, for me, it was so good because it really made me face some of the stereotypes that I was holding about other people, and really learning about others, right? People who are not like me. And it was such a rich experience that I walked away with. What I appreciated is that my employer made the space for me to go to that training, right? So I think within organizations, if we create, and sometimes budget can be challenging, I get that. But I think within the workspace, if we can create those opportunities for staff to go to different trainings, to have different speakers, do brown bags, and to just learn different things about DEI. And a lot of people say DEIB, so belonging as well. I think it's a start. I think it's a start. And I think also the part that's hard is acknowledging that we have biases, even in the context of organizations. We have there's a lot. The people have different experiences. But I think also you have to have, I think as a leader, be willing to say that I'm not always right. And maybe there are some biases here, even positive biases. You may have an affinity towards a certain person in the office, and that's who always gets promoted. But it's being willing to have those conversations and to take a step back and try to be honest with yourself and say, okay, this is where I am, and where can I get support to try to work through it? It's not going to be perfect, but I think we have to have grace for ourselves and then extend that same grace to others.
Yeah, you got me thinking also of when are those moments that we may recognize a bias that comes up, and one that might be implicit as well, because you're right, like folks can go on through life and they may have a bias, and until it it's in front of them that this affects another person, or the other person expresses that it affects them, like that may not come to light. And even then, there's that opportunity to want to even step into that. Oh, this is actually harmful towards another
Right.
person. And I think that's something I've gone through my own personal journey of as well, where it's going through so much of my life with whatever that narrative is. And
Hmm.
until, at least for me, I know that when it affects another person and when it's visibly harming another person, like I have to then come into this moment of reflection and just working through that narrative
Hmm.
to reconfigure, so to speak, what that is now that I can start to change. So yeah, thank you for bringing up that point.
Hmm.
Hmm. Now, I think as we start to unpack what intersectionality is and also like what that could look like, I think there's another piece of it is what is something that most people get wrong when it comes to intersectionality. So maybe they have this sort of assumption of what it is, but then it's, oh, you're missing the mark completely here.
Hmm.
So what would some of those things be?
I don't know. I think sometimes people think intersectionality is like it's just race or it's culture, and they don't understand. So, like when you think about the original kind of story of how Kimberly Crenshaw coined that term, she was looking at a law case, and there was a Black woman who had applied for a job in a manufacturing company, and she didn't get the job, right? And so she sued, saying she was being discriminated against. The court had found, they said, this company hires women and this company also hires Black men. So therefore, there is no discrimination because they hire both of these groups. But what the court didn't understand is because she was both a woman and Black, that was double discrimination, right? And so that in itself was uniqueness. Sometimes when we think about intersectionality, we think of it as like one thing, and we don't understand how multiple identities can cause people to suffer more, right? So I may be, you may say, okay, let's say maybe someone is a Latino male, right? Okay, that's Latino and male, that's two different identities. But if you have somebody who's Latino, male, and maybe undocumented, that's another layer of complexity, right? They're going to experience some other maybe barriers or lack of access because of their status, right? So there's the different ways that those intersect is then what we experience. And so I think we can't think about ourselves as just one identity because it's just not true. We're multiple identities. And I think that sometimes can be the misconception that it's just one thing. And it's no, it's multiple. It's not just, and it also is not just race and gender. It can be sexual orientation. It can be your identity. It can be class. It can be a multitude of things that make up who you are. Hope that makes sense.
Totally does. It's reminding me of a conversation I had with a coworker a few years back. I'm a 34-year-old cisgender gay man, and he is like a 37-year-old cisgender gay man. And I was referring to our community as queer.
Mm-hmm.
He, being a few years older than me, grew up in a time where that word wasn't as socially acceptable. And I think that I just projected like we are both gay men, we are comfortable with this term, but
Mm-hmm.
our identities and the way that we navigate and move through the world are different, even though it might on its head look like we are very similar individuals. Yeah, there's
That's a
complexity
great,
there.
great example. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, could you share maybe either a personal or just an example of how intersectionality shapes one's identity and experience?
Sure. Yeah, I can think of one from, I'll give you one from, I was at a training one day, and you know how in a training normally they do the icebreaker, say your name and how long you've been at the company, blah, blah, blah. And so this particular one, I was like near the front. I was going to be like maybe the first or second or third person to go. And so they said, okay, tell us your name, how long have you been with the company, your preferred pronouns, and something maybe that no one knows about you. And so as they're sitting there, and I'm like, what are preferred pronouns? Now, this is maybe, I don't know. This is maybe 6, 7 years ago, probably longer than that, probably like 8, 9 years ago. And they said, what are your preferred pronouns? And so I didn't know what that meant. So I'm like on my phone trying to Google really quickly because it's coming up, right? And so the lady next to me gives her name, and then she says, oh, my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I said, okay. And I was like, oh, okay. So now I'm still a little confused, but I'm like, okay, that's a pronoun. So I'm like doing all this thing in my head. Anyway, get to me. I do my introduction, she, her, hers. We go around. And it's a big room. I don't know, maybe 25 people. We get to an individual, they share their information, and then they say, my pronouns are they, them. And I looked, And I go, oh. And I had this moment of what I thought was basic. Because in my head, I'm going, once I heard the woman in front of me go, I was like, oh, yeah, duh, my pronouns are she, her, hers. Like, I'm a woman, duh. I was so confused. But when I got to this individual who I thought in my visual thought was a man, they identified as them, they, theirs. And that's when I said, okay, this is not. And then it clicked. I was like, oh, okay. And so after that training, I spoke with a colleague and I said, talk to me more about this. And this was a DEI training. It was like one of the first ones I had gone to with that company. And we had this really robust conversation, but I was safe enough with that individual to say, I'm ignorant in this area. And I just saw now this displayed of, oh, there are different types of identity. I did not understand that. And so hearing the pronouns, I was like, oh. And then later on, getting to meet that individual and learn who they were, I was like, okay, I get it. And that individual had multiple identities. And also, and just them sharing with me, had faced multiple levels of discrimination, right? Partly due to people's ignorance and not understanding and being accepting of something different from what you think you're used to. So I hope that that's the great example that came to me. But in my own place, I was ignorant and I was like, oh, that's what this, I didn't know. That was just like a given. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And it resonates something in me, like just that I heard from another individual not too long ago. And they're saying like the practice of that is this opening of the space to really support those who may not feel open to sharing their identities.
Yeah.
And especially I think the word that may have been used was just like, think about how those who have that sort of expression of their identities being they, them, or even other identities
Mhm.
that they identify as for the pronouns, it's how do they then feel in that space, and how are we considering them to be able
Yeah.
to grant them that safety to even share that? Because in other
Right.
spaces they may not have felt that, or they may have had some other forms of discrimination. And so I think you gave that example from that standpoint of your own of, wow, like I didn't know about this, but
Hmm.
there's an openness to want to know about this,
Hmm.
especially in the context of the folks within the same space as you.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think given that example and even looking ahead, if you're thinking about what other steps can individuals and organizations start to take to advance intersectional understanding and just promote more inclusivity in all aspects of the work.
Mhm. I think I would say start having conversations. Start having conversations. I think we've gone through so much, the world has gone through so much just in the last year and a half. And it's caused, it presents an opportunity to have conversations, very difficult ones, but I think it's important for us to bridge those gaps. Because I think what I've seen is this. I've seen that folks have just gone along and we assume that we're accepting, we assume that everything is fine and we're okay with differences. But then there's been things that have happened, and then you see other sides of people, and you're going, wait a minute, that's what you believe, those are your views. And it's not right or wrong, but it's how do we have a conversation so I can better understand where you're coming from, so you can better understand where I'm coming from. We don't have to always agree, but how can we have the understanding so we can bridge the gap, still be able to work with one another, but have grace for each other? And I think right now, the way that things are, we are very much in need of grace. We're very much in need of grace. And so I think start having the conversation because I think the trainings are good. I think having lectures and learning about ADEI or DEIB, whatever you want to call it, I think is great. But you got to start having the conversations because what we don't want is for conversations of intersectionality or anti-racism to be a checkbox. We have this ADEI officer over here. We did this mandatory training. We've checked the box, we've done it. But how do people feel in your organization? Can they talk about the election results? Can we have a debrief? Are people safe to come and say, I'm not feeling safe right now? Can we talk about it? Can we say, my colleague said this? Can we have a conversation? If the answer to that is, I don't know, or no, then that means the organization or the program or the context in which people are working has some work that can be done. And I think you start with having a conversation with people and being willing to be wrong and being willing to listen to other people because what they say it's a what is it? It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's a marathon. And this is us living out life together. Intersectionality is going to never, it's not going to stop being at the top of the conversation. As long as we're human beings, we're going to have different identities. And it'll be continuing as an opportunity to try to bridge the gap between the differences and value, hopefully, the differences that we all bring to the table.
Yeah, I had a thought that came into my mind right now, which is just building off of that of like how can or how then organizations can step into more of those conversations because you're right, as folks bring in their intersectionality into the workplace, along with just everything that happens in the world that impacts them, there's a tendency for others, oh, here is work and here is what's outside of work. But
Right.
then sometimes it's never as simple as that. People still
Yeah.
inherently show up to work being impacted by something. And I wonder there is some sort of like tuning in from the individual, but tuning in from even leaders of, okay, like how can I at least have a sense that could be happening? And how do I then create spaces where some of that can be offered? Folks may
Hmm.
show up, folks may not,
Yeah.
but being able to even offer, hey, you know what, like things are just going to be impacting for folks.
Yes.
And like you said, offering spaces for conversation.
No, I think definitely it's the little things, right? I think with the pandemic, one of the positive things it's brought is that kind of crossover between work and home because a lot of us start working at home, right? And then even now in 2024, a lot of us are still at home working or we're doing hybrid. And so you may be on a Zoom and your kid's in the background or your cat walks past the camera. And so I think we have a little bit more fluidity in the workplace that can create an opportunity to have those conversations of I think we're gone from the days of you're over here at work and what's at home stays home and then you just come here and be here. Those days are gone. I feel like everything that's happening in the world impacts all of us. And so it is maybe coming up with some community agreements within your organization or within the unit that you work in an organization, and then bringing those agreements to every meeting. Hey, this is what we agreed that we need to feel safe in this space. This is what we agreed to that we need to honor one another and to be able to communicate across our differences. Just that little thing starts to bridge the conversation, right? It is saying, hey, I heard this term right after the election called election fatigue. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And as I've sat on it for the past week or so, and I was like, oh, I think I can understand that. And so it's me in my classroom saying, hey, y'all, I know we just had the election. I want to give us some space to just check in. Not acting like it didn't happen, which is what a lot of people I think went to work the next day. We're just not going to talk about this. You know what I mean? It's creating the space. And so whatever it is that's happening in the world is creating the space to go, hey, maybe I'm going to leave my Zoom open today for an hour. If you just want to pop in, it's open. We can talk about whatever you like, right? If you're having a rough week, let's just check in and pop in. And to your point, like you said, Charlie, it's optional. You can come in if you like, but here's the space. It's just taking those little, I think those little steps starts to create that culture and be genuine with it. Don't be inauthentic. If it's not your thing, go get a consultant, go find a friend. Hey, I need to do this. This is not my thing. Being vulnerable is not really something that I'm used to doing, but get a coach, have somebody help you to get there as a leader and then create those spaces.
Really appreciate where you took this conversation. I think also as we're learning about others' identities and the different parts that make them, it isn't necessarily the onus of that marginalized individual to explain to the larger group or the group in dominance how they approach the world and why they may think differently. And it does take this personal, I think, ownership as well as an individual to inform ourselves the best that we can, to seek information, to ask questions, to be vulnerable, to sit with individuals. I'm also just thinking about generally like it feels from my perspective at least this kind of like workplace has existed the same way for a very long time. Like you come in, you do your job, you smile, you don't bring your emotions, you are a human robot that creates productivity for whatever organization or group you're in. And then we all experience the pandemic collectively. And I think we're rightfully encouraged to look at the way that other groups, marginalized groups, have been treated by dominant society. And so we've experienced systemic racism, and we're understanding that as a society. And we're starting to explore concepts like working with and across differences, identifying our identities and how we show up, about bringing our emotions. And all of that is incredibly, it's gray, it's vulnerable, it's abstract, it's difficult to really understand. And you mentioned this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. I think that's so poignant. We talk a lot within our DEI work at the Academy about how it's about the journey, not the destination. Like we're not one day going to be a DEI-ified organization, right? Like we're always constantly trying to take in new information and adapt to work better with one another. But that isn't easy, and it takes a lot of emotional work. So I guess I say all that to just to thank you for being here today, for explaining to us from your perspective what intersectionality is and giving us kind of some framework to continue moving forward.
Thank you. It's been fun. It's been enlightening. I learned a new term. What you said earlier about oh goodness, Shane, I forgot it. You said it was affect, and what was the other word?
The affective capacity.
See, that's new. That's a whole new, you have to teach me about that.
Audrey, good news for you. We have an entire podcast episode about it.
Oh,
That will
good.
be a part of
I
this
will be
series.
tuning in.
Fantastic. To our listeners, we hope you found this discussion as enlightening and inspiring as we did. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more conversations with experts who are making a difference in the world of DEI. And if you have any questions or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay committed to making the world a more inclusive place.